here we are, Talbot Street.
Everybody's come through the doors of this building, haven't they? And all sorts of things.
Yeah, they've come through for the complaints, confessions to murder, and of course Jerry Hutch snuck in this building as well late at night one night and did an interview.
And flowers.
And flowers.
Don't forget the flowers, because we're going to tell all these stories at the Cork Podcast Festival, which is our show's actually on the 30th of March in the Opera House. Tickets are on sale from the corkpodcastfestival.ie, and they're selling fast. We've only got, 2 weeks left?
2 weeks left, yeah.
Okay, so we're going to cover a couple of cases today. One of them involving yourself as a defendant, I suppose, and another one involving Cheryl Tweedy. And I suppose that sounds sort of funny, but of course, at the core of these, it isn't in any way amusing at all.
No.
Obviously, Cheryl Tweedy, people will have read that a guy has been jailed for 4 months, basically for persistently harassing her. And it just echoes, I suppose, a case where your own name appeared in the Sunday World in relation to a guy called Mark McAnaw.
Yeah, but actually, when I was reading about this case with the Cheryl Tweedy, sometimes you see these celebrities and stalkers and, actually, sometimes it's messages or whatever.
Yeah, it sounds a bit.
But for me, it goes up a level when the individual, usually fantasies, arrive into your
living,
either your living area or where you work or something personal. So they're kind of crossing a barrier there. And that's what happened to her.
Yeah. And also, if you look at the guy, and his name is Daniel Bannister, you see that he has a very sinister criminal past. So that adds another element of reality to the fear and the danger that these people inspire.
He showed up at her property and had basically turned up first in January of 2024, and he claimed he'd come to get Cheryl.
Yeah.
And in July the same year, he called again, knocked on the intercom and said to her, "I'm really thirsty. I just want a glass of wine, please," which we were laughing at.
Yeah.
It's not exactly the first thing if somebody's thirsty.
No.
So anyway, he showed up again then, despite the fact that there was a barring order on him.
Yeah.
And a restraining order, they call them, and at her Buckinghamshire home, and he rang the bell again. Now, scary, somebody is defying the law with the restraining order, and they're at your gates. Okay,
yes.
She might have a lot of security, and he mightn't get much further than that. But the idea, I think, that somebody would come into your arena.
Yeah. And of course, then you do hear a bit about his background. So Bannister had previously been jailed in 2012 for manslaughter, and it involved an attack on a guy called Rajendra Patel and in a hostel, basically. It basically amounted to a sort of an attack on this guy who died as a result of his injuries. Probably wasn't designed to kill him, but it was a violent attack. He served a prison sentence in connection with that. So you can see how this isn't this is a guy who's got that capability at the very least. Again, speaking about the case that you were involved in, it's again somebody with a very, very sinister past. A man called Mark McAnaw has been convicted in relation to threats against 3 people that we have worked with. 2 people that you've worked with, because one of the third is yourself.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
But Mark McAnaw turned up in this office in reception, basically, brazenly, and demanded people deal with him, I suppose, in the aftermath of sending a number of very, very sinister threats. Now, again, I suppose you've made a distinction between maybe somebody saying something weird on a social media profile.
I think it's very different. Somebody, look, you're going to get yourself a lot of kind of crazy messages, some of them funny, some of them a bit, you kind of get a bit used to it.
Yeah.
These sort of keyboard warriors will send you threats out. I mean, there was something actually recently I noticed, and I don't usually read the messages. I happened to be reading something. We had done a podcast, and there was people, I'd say one person actually with different profiles going on about, God, your security must be really good.
Yeah.
In other words, you're talking about this, you're going to get yourselves killed, that kind of thing.
Okay.
But and not to sort of say that becomes slightly the norm with us in a way, which is not ideal, but it does. And you also, I think when you're doing the job of a crime journalist, you learn how to protect yourself. You are your first port of call when it comes to protection. Now, we're very, lucky in that if there is any serious threats, we do have a very good relationship with the guards, liaison officers. There is special units who are there to, investigate anything like that against members of the media. And obviously you're from a big corporate entity who are used to this kind of thing. So they, you're wrapped in cotton wool almost if anything should occur. And the support I have found in the past of the government, the TDs, and there's, outrage about anything like this.
Yeah. And so then on the lower level, the just sort of simple trolling, really.
Yeah.
We're both not as young as we were, and our skin isn't as thin as it once was either. So that doesn't even register.
Yeah.
But this category,
you've levels of it, and you have a bit of trolling, and sometimes you might meet somebody, out on the street or whatever, who will opportunistically, but you have ways of knowing how to protect yourself, and in general as well, I think you keep out of certain places, and it just becomes the norm.
Yeah.
But how do you deal with this? Was for me with the case of Mark McAnaw. All that I've learned over the 30 years could not have been applied to him.
No.
Because he was a fantasist with a very serious conviction in the past for raping a woman. Yeah. And he had sent a series of emails to me, which I had by and large ignored. Yeah. Because they were sort of like, they felt ridiculous. Yeah. He was he wanted to come and meet me. He wanted to bring me out for dinner. He mentioned Amanda Brunker, who used to work with us. And I didn't know at the time actually that he was also communicating or trying to communicate with another journalist in the office. But he was talking about, he was due in court. He was going to get the bus from Donegal down to Dublin O'Connell Street, and he'd be at my office to collect me, bring me out for dinner. I think we were going to go to my house. This was his fantasy. Do a little bit there, and which involved, him. I mean, he wanted to have sex in my house. Yeah. And then he wanted to take me from there over to Amanda Brunker's, where we were all going to go over there. So again, I just, it was a bit hardcore, but I did ignore it. And usually when you ignore these things, they go away. But sure enough, he lands into the office to follow up on this fantasy, in his head that he's going to do this. That's where he became, for me, a bit scary. And I wasn't in the office the day that he came in looking for me. He didn't think there was anything wrong with it. He went from the office across the road to a coffee shop to wait for me and started emailing me to say he was in the coffee shop waiting for me, where he was ultimately apprehended by the Gardaí. But it was that idea that all you've learned couldn't be applied. No. Because this was a guy who was acting upon a crazy, irrational fantasy.
Yeah, I suppose this isn't somebody who's fearful of being caught. This is somebody who's doing it publicly. Therefore, this person is fundamentally not rational. Yes. Not capable of acting in a coherent way, and is literally capable of anything. Yeah. I know
they are the cases I felt that, sometimes they can go really badly wrong. I wasn't here had I walked out that day onto Talbot Street, as we do. I mean, Talbot Street's a terrible name, but I like Talbot Street actually, and plenty of the characters on it. Feel very comfortable on it. So, but what would have happened had I met this guy this particular day when he's acting out this fantasy? That, for me, was a bit of a horror show, because there was nothing that I could have done really to, obviously he was...
Yeah, look, he's not going to be restrained by, somebody might see me doing this. And obviously he had sent similar types of emails to Deirdre Reynolds. Yes. People would know from a great column in the Sunday World. And
of course, when he physically arrived in, then you kind of start untangling who this guy is.
Well, yeah, because I think...
we realised that there was history.
Yeah, because I think he had a different spelling on his email, which didn't match up to to what we know about him now. But I'll read out about his convictions. Mark McAnaw is from 52 from Letterkenny in County Donegal. Now, he has numbers of previous convictions, but they include a conviction for raping a foreign student in Donegal in October 2010. He was convicted in 2012 of orally raping and sexually assaulting the student, and he was given a 9-year sentence. But he also has a conviction back in 1989 for kidnapping and convictions for assault causing bodily harm conviction for 1989 and another conviction for assault causing or actual bodily harm in Derry in 2011. So this isn't somebody not to be, to dismiss. He's capable of these acts of extreme
he attacked
violence.
a woman in her home days after they got on a date together in April of 2018, and he had arrived at her home armed with a large kitchen knife and forced his way in.
Yeah.
He received an 8-year, 4-month sentence for that. And it was in June 2023 that was backdated to 2018 when he went into custody. Now, the thing about McAnaw was he wasn't long released from custody when this campaign started against myself and Deirdre Reynolds and Amanda Brunker. So, that was another sort of bit of a scary part of it, really. You know what I mean?
Well, let's read some of what he was said to Deirdre. Like he says to her, a fucking basic thing like a normal phone call confirming that I can stay at your house. He wants this from her and said, if you try and lastminute.com me, it'll be a life-threatening mistake. I will turn up and put bullets in your nut. What happens to you will be your doing. So this is deeply unhinged and part of this sort of fantasy is a fantasy of violence and sort of domination, I suppose.
And I noticed there that in Deirdre Reynolds' victim impact statement, she had said he referred to himself as being an IRA top boy, which is exactly what he did in my case. Now, he eventually, that case has been going through the courts, which is why we weren't able to talk about it. He has been found guilty and he's awaiting sentencing, which was adjourned the last day because they're looking for probation and psychiatric reports for him. And the sentencing has been kicked down the road to June 5th when it may or may not, depending on whether those reports are due. But, even in the courtroom, and we had to, of course, he looked for bail. First of all, after he was taken into custody on this, and we had to go and give evidence at a bail hearing. And he was he was sitting there in a courtroom surrounded with prison officers. There was Gardaí there was the judge, obviously, lawyers. And he was sort of kicking off in the courtroom. You know what I mean? In behind a glass wall. He's kicking off and he's like, he was definitely not somebody that you come across often. I mean, in a way, you do have to handle it like that as well. He's a rarity, this kind of guy, Mark McAnaw. And I also would feel that, probably there might be something in those psychiatric reports that
no doubt.
He seems to have had a long history of problems.
I mean, it says in court that he had been off medication that he'd been taking and that he is currently detained at the Central Mental Hospital. So that gives you some indication, but just because somebody suffers from some condition doesn't mean they're not dangerous or capable of violence either. For sure.
But I mean, it just shows you Cheryl Tweedy was there at her house and this guy lands up to the door. Again, it's the same thing. It's this, the stalker has a sort of a fantasy relationship with you, whether that's a friendship or a romantic relationship, whatever they believe that to be. They also are going to feel rejected because, nobody in their right mind is going to adhere to this fantasy and go along with some random punter who, behaves in this crazy fashion. And then that rejection is going to always kick off in anger. And that's where your danger zone is, really, isn't it?
I mean, that's it. It's it's obviously going to be rejected, but in their head, this relationship is ongoing. And, it's, I suppose, ego death when that moment comes when this person turns up or, knocks on the door and they're told, or arrives in work and they're met with this, blank stare at best. That's a death for them of their ego and their fantasy, and they react with violence. And there's probably other people with fantasies who, when they're rejected, go into a hole and never come out. But these are a different type.
Yeah.
When they're put off, they react back.
And it seems as if a lot of this is, focused on women, but actually men too can be the victims of these sort of stalkers. Obviously, a very big show last year on Netflix was Baby Reindeer.
Yes.
And really that was all around that kind of problems, mental health, that obsession, and how it affects somebody's life.
Yeah.
She's probably the most famous of the female.
Well, she is. And, obviously there was no... it was an incredible program, actually. I thought it was really good, and she's disputed some of the facts of it. But it just shows you, I suppose, people have these fantasies with public figures and feel that they know them in some way. But yeah, I mean, I think it's also a hard thing to police, actually. So this is the other complicated bit of it.
Yes.
So a threat, like in order for this, in the case that you're involved in, the threat are very explicit. He's going to kill people, and there's no real, that barrier is easily reached. But I think in a lot of the cases that we come across with people phoning in, it can be on that line where it can be, somebody can be saying things that can be read one way or another. And you described it there about how that tweet earlier you're talking about, where you could interpret that as one way, as in you hope you have great security, or you can interpret it another way with a sinister intent. So if people can be on that line, the level of fear caused by it can be just as great. But the threat, unless the threat is explicit, it's very difficult. Now, there are changes in the legislation that have come about that make it more straightforward, I suppose, in terms of the level of contact and not abiding by people's wishes to be left alone. But it is something that can be difficult to police, and it's something that sometimes the police don't want to get involved in. We hear it every week. Anybody can open up social media and you'll hear different public figures talking about threats, and sometimes those things are difficult because if you're a politician, for example, and somebody is saying something to you, there's a degree that people are allowed to comment on political figures. There's a degree that you're allowed to make contact with a politician. However, the politicians themselves can feel, this is frightening me, and I don't want people at my door, or whatever it is. So it is a difficult thing to police, and I think we've seen that. I mean, your case, very different. I mean, it's very black and white.
And do you know what? And I did write this I wasn't actually there for the sentence hearing, but I did write it in this victim impact statement, because we all had to provide one of those. That in my case, I had a really positive experience of both the guards and the legal system with this case, because the Gardaí acted very quickly, I suppose, when he physically showed up, and literally landed himself in it, because he emailed me to tell me where he was waiting.
Yeah.
So, I was able to contact the Gardaí and tell them exactly where he was. And I think, he was actually emailing me when they first apprehended him. But they were able to very quickly put together the case against him, take the statements. It was pretty clear what had happened. And when they brought him to court, when the DPP, first of all, came back and, said that these charges should be brought against him, he was immediately taken into custody. So that made things a lot easier. I mean, I also said I wouldn't claim to be in any way long-term affected by this or being particularly traumatised by this. It was something that happened. It was more what could have been, really, that was the frightening aspect of it. But he was immediately taken into custody. And while he constantly agitated for bail, the judges that attended to those bail hearings listened very carefully to his background, engaged very closely in the case and refused him the bail. Yeah. So we at no point had a situation where he was out of custody, which must be really scary for people who are in a similar position. And when they get out and you know they're out there somewhere.
Yeah, because obviously he came into the building, so we had CCTV of him coming into the building. You had a security man who he spoke to, and then he walked across the station. So it's all very straightforward.
Yeah.
And then the bail hearing they will have heard his criminal past. And so, it could be, we have, of course, I can think of one case straight off the top of my head for a woman who was receiving these threats and, when the guy was confronted, he just simply denied it.
Right.
And it becomes very difficult to prove. And even if you do prove somebody was at your door, if
it's
you deny
your word against theirs.
Exactly. So it can be difficult.
Not enough probably to keep somebody in custody then, if there isn't enough to keep them in custody, because the judges are just operating as they have to within the law as well. If there isn't simply enough to keep somebody in custody, they can't. They have to let them out.
No. And I mean, the basis on which people are refused bail would be, posing a risk and, posing a risk of flight, So you can't just keep somebody in bail because you don't like the look of them, I suppose.
But you know what I'd like to do in this case, because I think it's interesting. Look, I am doing the job I've doing for the 30 years and it's maybe not a totally normal reaction is my one to feel that I haven't been in any way particularly affected by this, or it's just something that happened or whatever. I get that's probably not the norm. So I would think it'd be interesting for us to talk to Deirdre Reynolds about how she felt about it, because she's not working in around the crime realm, or probably hasn't received anything like this before.
No.
She was sort of randomly chosen by him and operates in a much more normal job than you and I.
She does.
She writes features and stuff like this. So it'll be interesting to see what her take on it is. And she's a very sensible, by the way, also, and down-to-earth person. Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how she felt about it, about this. And of course, maybe as well, it'll be worth talking to Amanda, because she has previous experience with this guy. McAnaw came for her a second time because he had previously been sort of stalking some years previous. And I actually only discovered this. It was after the big drama of him coming into the office, and he had been spoken to in Talbot Street, and then he went back up to Donegal. It was in Donegal, actually, he ultimately ended up being arrested. But it was only after all that happened that Amanda contacted me, and that I realised that she'd had this history with him. So when he was emailing me and saying he was coming down, I had no idea that anything in this was true.
Yeah.
But of course, he was saying he knew Amanda before and everything. I just thought that was, again, his fantasy. But that bit of it was true because she had previous experience. So it would have been a very frightening experience for her, for someone to come back a second time.
Exactly. And he's only just out of prison. So you end, if we're ending this, just to say that stalking is a crime under the Criminal Justice Miscellaneous Provisions Act in 2023. So it's relatively new legislation, and it was brought in. It was only brought in recent times through the Dáil, and your legal options are, if you're, it depends on whether it's somebody you know, if it's a former partner or something like that. But you can now get what's called a restraining order or civil order against relevant contact, and it's an order against the offending person to stop the behaviour. Yeah. So before, it had to be a kind of under the threats to life. But what now exists is this kind of civil order that you can go and get, and it would ban the person for using threatening to use violence, following you or communicating by any means with you, or approaching you in a particular place such as home, workplace or school, or doing anything else the court specifies. So that's newer legislation. I don't know exactly when it was signed, but only in very recent times. And it does give people that extra protection if they feel that's what they can do. And you can apply for that at the district court. And if there's some of the domestic violence and women's charities would have further information about that.
Yeah. And look, we will return to this and we'll bring in Deirdre Reynolds and speak to her about it, and maybe perhaps after the sentencing we'll do that. In the meantime, if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask about it, keep your questions coming into our Q&A line, which is...
Go on. Is it crimeworld@sundayworld.com?
Yeah. Yeah.
It is.
Why is that so hard? It's like remembering your own name.
It's because you're in your advanced stage, I would imagine.
The advanced stages of something else, yeah. Anyway, so keep questions coming into crimeworld@sundayworld.com, and we will get around in the next couple of weeks to doing some more of those Q&A episodes that people seem to like, because we're sort of handing over the narrative to you, the listener and the viewer, to direct us to areas that we wouldn't necessarily know would be of interest to you. So if you have any questions around this case with McAnaw or anything, do feel free to send them in. I'm happy to answer what I can. And also anything else you have around any of the more recent Crime World episodes we've had. We always get a selection of questions about Daniel Kinahan, Mr. Big. Who are our top?
Jonathan Dowdall has always been.
Jonathan Dowdall's a favourite, yeah. He is. And the monk, obviously, and all the rest of them. But, anything else you want to ask, please do send them in. So thanks for that.
Thanks, Nicola.
Robbie Lawler was out of control.
This is Double Cross, the murder of Robbie Lawler.
It was going to be an all-out war with him in the middle of it.
A Crime World special investigation podcast based on my new book, Web of Betrayal, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.